Hi, this is Don Forsyth with yet another installment of Group Dynamics. Our topic today is the individual and his or her connection to the group. Basic topic. There's three subtopics that we need to deal with, and they're a bit lengthy, and so I'm going to break it up into three separate presentations. The first issue that we need to address is that tension between the individual and the group. Individual human beings were capable of surviving independently of all other people, but we generally don't do so. It's the very rare individual who keeps apart from others at any time in their lives. There are some exceptions, but most of us seek out membership in group. Why is that? Is it part of human nature? Do we have a pressing need to belong, which is satisfied best by joining together with others in groups? We'll talk about that. We'll also deal with the question of individualism and collectivism, and also deal with the theory of social identity, which explains how your perceptions of who you are, yourself, undergoes change when you join a group and begin to identify with the group. Having slight technical difficulties. It's difficult to get the sound to line up with the video, so if you'll bear with me, we'll move through these topics. Thank you for joining me as always. Hey, the first topic we need to address then is the need to belong. Three subcomponents: need to belong, inclusion and exclusion, and human nature. Beginning with the question of human nature. Do human beings need to be with others? Is that need so great it qualifies as a fundamental human motivation? It's true that isolation can be rejuvenating. Some of us do like to spend time alone, isolated from others, but for the most part, isolation is negative. Stranded individuals, lost explorers have a difficult time coping with solitude. Solitary confinement is recognized as a severe form of punishment, particularly when prolonged. If you look at the demographics of people and ask them about the groups they belong to, people tend to belong to quite a few groups, and the emerging concept of social capital suggests that individuals' connections to others determines their value overall to society, and they create that by sustaining relationships in face-to-face settings and also in online communities. Just a bit of data that these days church membership in congregations remains the most reported type of membership, followed by participation in sport groups. So those would be teams, both formal and informal. Professional associations, membership in school groups, that would be, for example, PTAs, veterans group, youth groups. These are all the basic types of groups that these data are from Americans, adults, continue to belong to. There clearly are shifts, though, over time in what sorts of groups people are joining. This caused Robert Putnam to suggest that we're at a time when traditional groups, small face-to-face groups of close friends, civic groups would be an example. Bowling leagues was his final example, are becoming rare, and other types of association are taking their place. So, for example, Facebook is a form of affiliation with others. It takes place online rather than face to face, but apparently it is meeting the need to belong. The question of loneliness when people aren't connected to others. How do they feel? Usually the word for that is loneliness, and a distinction is typically made between two forms of loneliness: social loneliness and emotional loneliness. Emotional loneliness, people suffer from that when they lack an intimate, close, romantic, typically, relationship. Social loneliness occurs when you don't feel connected to other people, particularly in an enduring, important way. Um, for example, going out and sitting in an audience in a movie theater, you'll be surrounded by people, but you really won't be integrated into a particular group. So this kind of a collective really doesn't provide any buffering for either social or emotional loneliness. In contrast, intimate groups could reduce emotional loneliness, and some highly structured intimate groups could reduce both social and emotional loneliness. So, for example, a therapeutic support group might not meet the need for your social engagement, but it would for emotional loneliness. And if we look at all these different types of groups, we see they vary in their usefulness in terms of meeting our need for social contact and emotional contact. Turning to the question of inclusion and exclusion, clearly if we feel a need to belong, we will likely respond negatively when we do not belong. And in fact, when we seek inclusion in groups and the groups turn us back. This chart comes from the work of Mark Leary, who makes a distinction between active and passive exclusion and inclusion. So when a group neither accepts us or rejects us, deals with ambivalently, the impact is not that great. But if a group excludes us, we feel rejected, and has far more negative consequences for us, particularly if they actively reject us. So we seek membership in the group, we make it known to that group that we wish to join that group, and they still reject us. Active inclusion, on the other hand, increases our satisfaction, particularly when the group seeks us out, that they want us to join the group. Currently, there's a considerable amount of research being done on the effects of ostracism and exclusion in groups using a lot of different methods. So, for example, the life alone paradigm, typically used by researchers such as Roy Baumeister, Nathan DeWall, tells people, gives them a personality measure, for example, and then warns them that they're the kind of people who may end up living their life alone, not a member of any kind of enduring groups. People find that kind of feedback threatening. Other methods are the ball toss paradigm, where a ball might be thrown back and forth between people in a four-person group, and eventually three of the people throw the ball back and forth to each other, and the fourth person never gets the ball. You can also do this online, which is depicted here, in the cyber ball toss paradigm, where, for example, these three individuals may not be real members of the group. They're computer generated. And player two, however, is the actual real member of the group playing online, who never receives the ball and therefore feels excluded. An exclusion paradigm is you gather people together in, say, a four-person group, and at the end of, say, 15 minutes of interaction, you let them know that a four-person group's too large, they're going to have to reduce their size to three, and ask the group members who should be excluded. And the individual who's excluded has been targeted to see what their reaction might be. Kip Williams' temporal need threat model of ostracism distinguishes between the reflexive stage and the reflective stage, and then finally the resignation stage. But when people find out they're being ostracized, when they detect signs that other people are excluding them, the quick reaction, the immediate reaction, is reflexive. It's not thoughtful. It's the experience of pain and negative affect. After you think about it, you'll figure out, well, what's going on here? Maybe I really wasn't excluded. Maybe I misunderstood their motives. What does it mean exactly? And do I even care? And so you will be able to fortify yourself in that way. But if exclusion occurs for a long period of time and you aren't able to cope with it through any kinds of psychological gymnastics, then you might experience alienation, depression, helplessness, and unworthiness. Research on inclusion and exclusion does identify two general classes of reactions to ostracism, and those are the fight-flight response and the tend-and-befriend response. So fight-flight means that people respond either very passively, they freeze up, they escape from the situation, or they respond with more negative energy. They take the group on. They point out the group's mistake in trying to exclude them. They try to force themselves into the group. Tend and defend responses, on the other hand, they increase their awareness of social cues. They do a little bit more. They try to change their behavior, so they act in ways that perhaps the group will find more acceptable, and eventually they will be taken into the group. Obviously, tend and befriend responses are more prosocial than fight and flight responses. There is some suggestion that some extreme forms of violence are due, at least in part, to the feeling of being excluded. So, for example, there have been in the last 15 years instances of extreme violence against specific groups in school settings, whereas a single individual or pairs of individuals used automatic weapons to attack others. The worst example being the mass shootings at Virginia Tech. Researchers, of course, have identified a lot of factors that fed into these very negative incidents, but one of them is the feeling of exclusion that generally the aggressors reported experiencing. Our final topic in the question of belonging, inclusion in human nature, is it really a fundamental need? And what makes a need fundamental? Baumeister and Leary, in their analysis of needs, have a long list of characteristics that must be met before we'll label something a fundamental need. But it does seem like the need to belong meets most of these requirements. It is perhaps a very basic need whose influence have you been able to see across all periods. So the idea is that perhaps there's a genetic basis for this desire to be part of a group. This chart illustrates the basic reasoning behind most evolutionary explanations of psychological characteristics. It is the idea that our genetic tendencies prompt some people to affiliate more, others to not affiliate so much, perhaps remain solitary. And so those alter their behaviors. If you have the gene for affiliation, you tend to join. If you seek solitude, you tend to stay apart. Although it's not a perfect relationship, there might be some cases where an individual who is solitary may seek to join out. Individuals then experience environmental challenges. They may not even seek them. And the idea is that affiliation, individuals who are joined together with others, were more successful in coping with these environmental challenges. In other words, being part of an intact, cohesive group helped people to survive and live longer and procreate, and therefore contribute their genetic tendencies to the gene pool and to the next generation. So that over time, the tendency to join groups was stronger in our genetic pool rather than the genetic tendency to remain alone, although loners might still be present. Leary speaks about all this process in his sociometer theory of self-esteem, and he also discusses this in his book, The Curse of the Self. He has the rather counterintuitive suggestion that self-esteem is not what we thought it was. Self-esteem is not just basically how you evaluate yourself, that it has another function, it has another purpose. It monitors how well you are accepted by other people. Your self-esteem drops, he argues, when you feel excluded or when you feel that you're doing things that are straining your interpersonal relations. And so that bad feeling you get, that feeling of low worth, is not because you are objectively appraising your characteristics and deciding whether or not they're good or bad, but in fact it's a monitor of how well you are integrated within your groups and how at risk you are for exclusion. Hence the name sociometer. In his research, he's found that when people do feel as though they've been excluded, their self-esteem drops. In this particular study, in one condition, individuals were included. In another, they were excluded. In some cases, they were excluded at random. In other words, using that exclusion paradigm, the investigator said, these groups are too big, we're going to have to drop one of you. I'm going to choose that person at random. There were no consequences in that case for self-esteem. But when the group apparently included you or excluded you, then self-esteem ratings demonstrated the relationship between inclusion and exclusion. Included individuals, their self-esteem went up. Excluded individuals, their self-esteem went down. So it wasn't simply being included in the group, it was being actively included by the group, which was what counts. And as Mark concludes, we need to think about ourselves occasionally, but none of us needs to think about ourselves as much as we do. Given that perhaps the need to belong has a biological basis, researchers have been looking to see how people respond neurologically to inclusion and exclusion. And they have been able to find areas of the brain which become more active, or in the language of neuroscientists, are recruited during the experience of exclusion. They are the same areas of the brain that are associated with physical pain. The idea is that feelings of physical pain are adaptive, alerting the individual to of possible harm and threat in the environment. Those systems were put in place long before psychological systems were, but in some cases, psychological processes simply mapped on to these existing biological ones. So, as the need to remain in groups became more important for survival, it mapped on to the pain regions of the brain. So, when you say, for example, my feelings were hurt, when people feel anguish when they're excluded, these are real feelings of pain similar to the pains that they would experience from physiological injury. Of all the studies which have demonstrated this, perhaps there's no better one than Dewall and his colleagues' analysis of the impact of taking a painkiller, acetaminophen, on social pain. They did discover that if individuals take acetaminophen before situations where they may be excluded and are excluded, they don't feel so bad about it after all. So, although we often think that aspirin, acetaminophen, are good for physical pain, they're also good for social pain as well. Our next topic will be the question of individualism and collectivism. We'll turn to that next. Thank you for joining me.